Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I am creating a card using these two stamp sets by Create a Smile. It's Magic Flowers and Crocuses. I'm also using this large smile, but from the Smile stamp set by Honeybee Stamps. I started off by stamping out my sentiment with VersaFine ink right in the center of my card panel. And this is Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I also stamped that word out on a piece of full stick post-it note, and I'm just going to take my scissors and cut around the edges of that word. It doesn't need to be perfect, just as long as your lines are straight and there's no jagged lines really. And then I'll go ahead and mask out that word the best I can. Now my plan for this card is to cover up the entire panel with the flowers from the two different stamp sets. So I am starting with my largest flowers here, and I'm stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. And this is where I dropped my stamp. So there are some smudges there. That's not where I was originally going to place that stamp again, but I tried to cover that up and line that up the best I could. Now I am using Simon Says Stamp masking paper to mask as I went along, and I only cut out one mask per flower because I'll just kind of move my masks around, save me a little bit of time. I'm starting by stamping out my larger images first and kind of building up my background. This is going to kind of make it look like I used a background stamp, only they are individual stamps. As I laid out my larger images, I filled in any areas that were missing something with the smaller images, the smaller flowers, and a few different leaves. Now I'm not going to be doing any ink blending or anything in the background, so my masks do not have to be perfect, just as long as the lines from the stamp don't overlap each other. If you're doing ink blending, you want to make sure that your masks are cut right along that black line so that you don't leave any white edges around your images when you do your ink blending. The stamping on this actually took quite a bit of time. Actually, even though I didn't really have a plan, I just laid out my images as I went along, filled in areas that I thought needed a little something. There is a little bit of white space in between some of my images, but I ended up filling that in later. I was going to leave it white, but I did end up filling that in after all my coloring was done. Especially with this sunflower, it's not symmetrical, so you kind of have to twist and turn your stamp to figure out how that's supposed to be laid out. But overall, all of the images were pretty easy. They weren't too intricate to cut out with my masks. Once all of my images were stamped, I went ahead and removed all of my masks. I was going to remove the mask for the sentiment, but I ended up leaving that there. I'm going to color right over it. It did bleed through a little bit, but we can always fix that in the end. So for the Copic coloring, I'll show you one of each flower. I started off with this sunflower that has a little bit of those ink smudges on it, just to make sure that I was going to be able to cover it up. I'm starting off with my lightest color and laying out where my darkest areas will be. I did add darker areas to the outside of the petals as well, mainly because I needed to use a darker color in order to cover up some of those ink smudges from when I dropped my stamp. And actually it wasn't too noticeable once I finished my coloring. So my shadows will be where the petal comes out of the center, the edges of the petal, and those smaller petals that are laying behind the larger ones. Those won't really have much of a highlight at all. Once I have my darkest color laid out, I will go ahead and extend those flicks with my two mid-tone colors, and then I'll go in with my lightest color, which is the Y marker. And those little ones, those little petals in the back, they really won't have much of that Y, if any at all. For the center of the flower, I'll be using some E markers. In order to make this look like it's popped up or the center is raised up a little bit, my darkest areas will be on the outer edge of that circle. There are some little dots that are part of the stamp, so I'll just add a few more of those also with my E markers. I started by filling in the entire thing with my lightest E marker just to kind of lay out some of that color, help it blend a little bit. And then I'll go around those edges with my darkest color and then blend that out towards the center. And I colored that other sunflower the same exact way. Now for this largest crocus, I think that's how you say it. I Googled this just because I didn't really know what they look like. And they're all different colors, but there are some like deep purple ones that I thought would be really pretty. So I'm starting off with my lightest color here, which was originally going to be my lightest color. It's a V01, and it's running dry. So I ended up switching to a V000, I believe it was. But my darkest color here is a V09, and I'm extending these flicks longer than I normally do for my darkest color because I wanted it to be a very, very deep color. And I don't want to blend out my flicks too much. I want them to be noticeable. When I Googled the pictures of these flowers, you could definitely see the lines within the petals. So I wanted to kind of maintain that. I did blend that out a little bit with my V06. Then I'll go on to my V04 and then my V000, just on the tips of the petals. I am going directly over that Post-it note mask. I'm trying not to go over it too much because I didn't want my ink to bleed through all that much. I knew it was going to a little bit, but this will prevent it from bleeding through too much where I won't be able to fix it in the end. The centers of these flowers, from what I could see, are all yellow, so I'm just using two different Y markers here. It's a very small area. You could easily get away with just one. Next, I will move on to these larger flowers. I don't know what these are supposed to be. I don't know much about flowers. So I'm just kind of creating my own dimension here. I am concentrating my darkest color in the center of the flowers, and where they kind of overlap, I'm leaving those areas white right now because that'll just be my light color. I'm using RV markers, and I know I've said this in the past, but they can be tough sometimes to blend, especially when you put down your lightest color. It will pick up and move your darkest colors more than any other color family that I've seen. So you don't want to over blend here. Number one, they can bleed outside of your image, and number two, you'll lose that contrast if you put too much of your lightest color down. For the centers, I am using two different colors here. I'm just kind of dotting in my darkest color, and then I'll just go over the entire area with the lightest color. Next, for my leaves, I am doing my shading. Basically, the darkest areas here will be where the leaves are kind of laying underneath the flowers. And then the edges of the leaves are kind of jagged. So where they're kind of indented in to the rest of the leaf, I'll add just a little tiny flick of the darkest color. And then each time I go down in intensity, I'll blend that out a little bit and then go over my entire leaf with the lightest color. Next, for these other little flowers, again, I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. I am using my lighter BG markers. In the end, we'll bring in some of those darker BGs. But I'm laying out my darkest color, like always, concentrating on the darkest areas being in the center of the flower, using flicking motions. Now, these BG markers can be a little bit hard to blend too, not quite as hard as the RV markers. So sometimes you'll have to do the tip to tip technique, especially when you go from the BG13 to the BG11. In this case, I didn't really have much trouble. They are smaller flowers, so I really wasn't worried about it too much. Now for this other crocus flower, I didn't want to color it the same as the larger ones, so I decided to go with a pink combination. And my darkest color here is actually an R35, which is more of a red color. But once you blend that out with the lighter R markers, it will appear to be pink. And I'm coloring this the same way as I did with the others, concentrating my darkest areas towards the bottom of the petal and flicking that out and then blending that out with my lightest color. Here I noticed I didn't get a great impression when I was stamping, so I just took a EK Success journaling pen and just filled in that area a little bit to make that line a little bit bolder. And the center of this one is even smaller than the other crocuses, so I'm just using the one single Y marker to fill in that little center of the flower. For these last flowers, I debated on what colors to use just because I felt like I was running out of colors to use on this background. So I decided to go with yellows again, but lighter than the sunflower. And I'm coloring these the same way as I'm coloring the other ones that I use the RV for. They're basically the same image. This is just a little bit smaller. And once my images were all colored in, I debated on what to do with that white space, whether to leave it or fill it in with another Copic marker. Ultimately, I decided to use a darker BG marker just to fill in those areas. There's not many. Here my marker blobbed again, so that took a little bit of time to clean up, but I was able to use my colorless blender enough to fix that. Once my background was all filled in, I went ahead and removed that mask from the sentiment, and you can see some of the areas that my Copic markers did bleed through. So the darkest areas, I went ahead and used my white gel pen just to fill that in. Some of the lighter areas, I used my colorless blender. When it was all done, I realized that some of those colors were seeping through a little bit, so I ended up after I got done recording, going over the white space with my C3 marker, just being careful because I did not use Copic Safe ink. But it didn't bleed at all, so I had no problem with that. But that is the card for today. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.